Dr. William Julius Wilson, the Geyser University Professor at Harvard University, is often introduced as follows. If there was a Nobel Prize in sociology, he certainly would have won it. As you can see from his biography, he's won virtually every other award he could possibly have. But I'd like to introduce Bill in a more personal way. It was in 1987. I was a first-year graduate student at Northwestern University. I was ushered into the ground floor of the Rebecca Crown Center at Northwestern, into a hall much like this, to hear a young upstart named Dr. Wilson present findings from his new blockbuster book, The Truly Disadvantaged. And I don't think I knew then, but it pretty quickly became clear that this would be a turning point in my life and would indeed set me on the path to the kind of poverty research I do now, along with a generation of other young people, because that book redirected social science back to the study of poverty. Now, you know the names Patillo, Venkatesh, Small, Sharkey, Kafalis, Carr, Waquant. So many leading poverty researchers in the United States were mentees of Bill's or passed through his classroom. It's truly a remarkable achievement. Another singular thing to know about Bill is that he really invented what we now call neighborhood effects research, the notion that it's worse to be poor and live among poor neighbors, isolated among poor neighbors, than to live in a more mixed-income neighborhood. And over the 20 to 30 years since that idea first entered our consciousness, again and again and again, the power of neighborhood context has been demonstrated, most recently in the remarkable work of Raj Chetty, Nathan Hendren, and Larry Katz. Bill is also one of the most amazing mentors and advisors. I was a colleague of Bill's for 8 years at Harvard, and I was always amazed that he was never too busy to make a meeting with a student and never came unprepared. He might have been the only one in the entire university who could say this. A wonderful colleague who was always about others and the greater good. Now, I have to say at least one entertaining thing about Bill. I remember on the, I believe it was the 25th anniversary of The Truly Disadvantaged, Bill and I and some other folks were traveling to Washington, D.C. For a celebration of the book. And many of us were sitting at the gate there at the airport, at Logan Airport, and the plane was about to board, and no Bill, no Bill, no Bill. Finally, just as boarding was announced, we were getting on the plane, he breezes in, and apparently this is his thing. He loves to tempt fate and not waste an extra minute at Logan that he doesn't have to. So join me in welcoming Professor William Julius Wilson.
Thanks very much, Kathy. It was a sad day when you left Harvard to join your faculty here at Johns Hopkins University. And I remember we were at the White House together. You were trying to make up your mind. We had a meeting at the White House. And I was pretty much convinced that I had persuaded you to stay at Harvard. And I went back to Harvard telling all my colleagues, she's coming back, she's not leaving, she's not leaving. 2 weeks later, you changed your mind. So. And it's Harvard's great loss and Johns Hopkins' great gain. You mentioned one of my former students, Patrick Sharkey. In his recent book, Stuck in Place, the subtitle, Urban Neighborhoods and the End of Progress Toward Racial Equality. Patrick Sharkey analyzed data from the panel study of income dynamics, a longitudinal study following people over time. And he used methods that measure intergenerational economic mobility. And Sharkey demonstrates the importance of gauging the longer-term effects of living in poor neighborhoods when considering racial differences. He states, quote, "When white families live in a poor neighborhood, they typically do so for only one generation. In Black American families, neighborhood poverty is commonly multi-generational." And he also found that since the 1970s, a majority of Black families have resided in the poorest quarter of neighborhoods in consecutive generations, compared to only 7% of white families, and that, quote, 72% of Black adults living in today's urban ghettos, that is neighborhoods that are majority Black and among the poorest quarter of all American neighborhoods, were raised by parents who also lived in a ghetto a generation ago. Now, in short, Sharkey states, the problem of the urban ghetto is not simply that it has persisted over time, but that the same families have experienced the disadvantages associated with life in the ghetto over multiple generations. And this problem can be particularly severe for children. Also analyzing data from a special supplement of the PSID, which includes a set of questions asked of children, Sharkey was able to examine how the development outcome of children differ dependent on the neighborhood environment history of their families. He found that children whose families live in disadvantaged neighborhoods over multiple generations show development outcomes that are substantially worse than children whose families reside in poor neighborhoods in a single generation, even after he took into account other family factors that might affect children's development. Now, we should also consider another important and related study on children's development that Sharkey co-authored with Robert Sampson and Stephen Rodenbush. Robert Sampson is my colleague at Harvard. Stephen Rodenbush is at the University of Chicago, which examined the durable effects of concentrated poverty on Black children's verbal ability. And they studied a representative sample of 750 African American children ages 6 to 12 who were growing up in the city of Chicago in 1995 and followed them for up to 7 years. The children were given a reading examination and vocabulary test at 3 different periods. And their study shows, and I'm quoting from the study, that residing in a severely disadvantaged neighborhood cumulatively impedes the development of academically relevant ability in children, unquote. Now, children's verbal ability certainly has consequences for school performances, including the completion of high school. Jeffrey Watke, David Harding, and Philip Ellsworth's important study demonstrates this, also using the panel study of income dynamics to examine the effects of long-term exposure to disadvantaged neighborhoods on high school graduation. They tracked 4,154 children by measuring their neighborhood context once each year from age 1 to 17, and found that continuous exposure to disadvantaged neighborhoods featuring high rates of poverty, unemployment, single-parent households, and welfare receipt, as well as few well-educated adults throughout the entire childhood life course has a devastating impact on the chances of graduating from high school. Now, let me take a closer look at such neighborhoods by examining the impact of changes in the class, racial, and demographic composition of inner-city neighborhoods. To put things in a broader context, indeed, with the steady outmigration of more advantaged families from many of these inner-city neighborhoods since 1970, the proportion of non-poor families and prime-age working adults has decreased sharply in many inner-city ghettos, especially in the Northeast and Midwest, resulting in significant depopulation. And this pattern represents an important change in the formation of neighborhoods. In the earlier years, say when Kenneth Clark wrote his book, Dark Ghetto, a book that I strongly recommend folks read, it was published in 1965. In the earlier years, communities undergoing racial change from white to black tended to experience an increase in population density as a result of the black migration from the South. And because of the housing demand, particularly in the late stages of the succession from white to black, homes and apartments in these neighborhoods were often subdivided into smaller units. However, 1970 marked the end of the great migration wave of blacks from the South to northern urban areas, and several developments affected the course of population movement into and out of the inner cities after that time. Improvements in transportation made it easier for workers to live outside the central city, and industries gradually shifted to the suburbs because of the increased residential suburbanization of the labor force and the lower cost of production. And because of the suburbanization of employment and improvement in transportation, inner-city manufacturing jobs were no longer a strong factor pulling migrants to Central City, migrants from the South. So with the decline of industrial employment in the inner city, the influx of southern black migrants to northern cities ceased, and many poor black neighborhoods, especially those in the Midwest and Northeast, for example, in cities like Baltimore, change from densely packed areas of recently arrived migrants to communities gradually abandoned by the working and middle classes, who have increased their efforts to move from concentrated black poverty areas to more desirable neighborhoods throughout the metropolitan center area. And with the departure of higher income families, the least upwardly mobile in society are left behind in neighborhoods with high concentrations of poverty and deteriorating physical conditions. And these neighborhoods offer few jobs and typically lack basic services and amenities such as banks, grocery stores, and other retail establishments, parks, and quality transit. And two of the most visible indicators of neighborhood decline are abandoned buildings and vacant lots. According to one report, for example, in 2006, there were 60 abandoned and vacant properties in Philadelphia, 40,000 in Detroit, and 26,000 in Baltimore. And those of you who have watched HBO's The Wire will realize that David Simon brilliantly captured this pattern: abandoned buildings, vacant lots, and the abandoned buildings were track users flocked. Now let's pursue these problems in an even broader perspective. Now, it's interesting to point out that 1970, as I mentioned previously, marked the end of the great migration of blacks from the South to the North, which resulted in a significant transformation of these neighborhoods. It also marked the beginning of an increased income segregation within the black community. Look at this figure. It presents data on income segregation by race in metropolitan areas with populations of more than 500,000. And the source of this figure is a 2014 study by the sociologist Kendra Bischoff and Sean Reardon. Now, this figure reveals that income segregation has grown rapidly in the last decade, and particularly among black and Hispanic families. And what is notable is that whereas African American families in 1970, so I'm partially colorblind. That's red, right, for African Americans? Okay. Looks purple. All right, so whereas African American families in 1970 recorded the least income segregation, they now register the highest income segregation. Now, please note that we are talking here about residential segregation among black families of different income levels, not segregation between black and white families. And another way of talking about these trend lines is that they describe the extent to which the exposure of families to neighborhoods, or to the exposure of families to neighbors of the same race, has changed over time. And although income segregation among black families grew considerably in the 1970s and the 1980s, it grew even more rapidly from 2000 to 2009, after slightly declining in the 1990s. And when considering a person's life trajectory or life chances, the differences in the quality of one's daily life between residing in a predominantly affluent neighborhood and a poor black neighborhood are huge. And it is important to note that today, Poor black families have fewer middle-class neighbors than they had in 1970. Indeed, the rising income inequality, or I should say the rising income segregation in the black community, is driven both by the growth of affluent blacks and the deteriorating conditions of poor blacks. And I wish I could share these figures with Donald Trump. Because there's good news and bad news here. Who tends to talk about African Americans as if they are a monolithic socioeconomic group, that is a severely disadvantaged group that has made little or no progress. Indeed, he is quoted as saying that black communities are in the worst shape ever. Well, let's disaggregate a bit here. As if there is no good news to talk about in the black community. But there is good news with the growth of affluent blacks, and there is bad news. And the deteriorating state of many poor inner-city neighborhoods is bad news. This rise in income segregation is driven both by the growth of affluent blacks and the deteriorating condition of poor blacks. And to repeat, poor blacks have fewer middle-class neighbors today than they had in 1970. And I'd like to just focus on these neighborhoods because they're represented in the city of Baltimore. One thing these neighborhoods feature is increasing and prolonged joblessness. They also feature a declining proportion of non-poor families. And, to repeat, overall depopulation, which makes it difficult for many of these neighborhoods to sustain basic institutions or to achieve adequate levels of social organization. The declining presence of working and middle-class blacks has also deprived these neighborhoods of key resources, such as residents with income to sustain basic neighborhood services like stores, including grocery stores. Now, all of these changes have had a profound effect on the social organization of these neighborhoods, resulting in a weak institutional resource base. A weak institutional resource base. You see, it is easier for parents to control the behavior of the children or young people in their neighborhood when the links between community institutions, such as churches, schools, political organizations, businesses, and civic clubs, are strong or secure. The higher the density and stability of formal organizations, the less illicit activities, such as drug trafficking, crime, prostitution, and the formation of gangs can take root in the neighborhood. By contrast, these activities thrive in neighborhoods with high rates of joblessness. Why? Because joblessness triggers other problems in the neighborhood, including declining neighborhood social organization. Take drug trafficking. A number of studies have revealed an association between the declining legitimate employment opportunities among inner-city residents and increased incentives to sell drugs. And neighborhoods plagued by high levels of joblessness and insufficient economic opportunities are unable to control the volatile drug market and the violent crimes related to it. Drug dealers escalate the use and spread of guns in the neighborhood, which in turn raises the likelihood that others, particularly youngsters, will come to view the possession of weapons as necessary or desirable for self-protection, settling disputes, gaining respect from peers and other individuals. As the criminologist Alfred Bloomstein pointed out, and as was depicted so clearly in HBO's The Wire, the drug industry actively recruits teenagers in the neighborhood, partly because they will work more cheaply and partly because they tend to be more daring and willing to take risks that more mature adults would eschew. Inner-city black youths, with limited prospects for stable and attractive employment, are easily lured into drug trafficking and therefore invariably find themselves involved in the violent behavior that accompanies it. Now, as I pointed out previously, when income segregation, the separation of families by income, is coupled with racial segregation, low-income blacks cluster in neighborhoods that feature disadvantages along several dimensions, including exposure to violent crime. Look at this figure. In 1978, poor blacks aged 12 and over were only marginally more likely than affluent blacks to be violent crime victims, roughly 45 and 38 per 1,000 individuals, respectively, in 1978. However, by 2008, poor blacks were far more likely to be violent crime victims, about 75 per 1,000, while affluent blacks were far less likely to be victims of violent crime, about 23 per 1,000. And violent crime can reach extraordinary levels in the poorest inner-city black neighborhoods. For example, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where 46% of African Americans live in what we call high poverty areas, that is, areas with poverty rates of at least 40%. Blacks are nearly 20 times more likely to get shot than a white person, and 9 times more likely to be murdered. Now, to repeat, a weak institutional resource base is what distinguishes these high, jobless, violent neighborhoods from more stable, middle-class and working-class areas. As one resident in a high jobless neighborhood on the south side of Chicago put it, quote, "Our children, you know, seems to be more at risk than any children there is, because there's no library for them to go to, there's not a center for them to go to, there's no field house they can go into, there's nothing at all," unquote. And here's the point. Parents in high jobless neighborhoods have a much more difficult task of controlling the behavior of their adolescents, of preventing them from getting involved in activities detrimental to pro-social development. And given the lack of organizational capacity and a weak institutional resource base in these neighborhoods, some parents choose to protect their children by isolating them from activities in the neighborhood, including avoidance of contact and interaction with neighborhood families, and whenever possible, and often with great difficulty, when one considers the problems of transportation and limited financial resources, they attempt to establish contact and cultivate relations with individuals, families, and institutions outside the neighborhood, such as church groups, schools, and community recreation programs. And when we look at high jobless inner-city neighborhoods, we should appreciate the restricted range of choices that are available to inner-city families and residents because they live under constraints and face challenges that most people in the larger society do not experience or can't even imagine. And I wish there was greater appreciation and awareness of their incredible ordeals, especially among national policymakers, to overcome beliefs that simply attribute joblessness and poverty to individual shortcomings. Such beliefs do not engender strong support for social programs to end inequality. Now, problems in these segregated inner-city neighborhoods are related to the problems of public schools in or near these neighborhoods. Research by scholars such as Sean Reardon reveal that schools with a high proportion of black students or a high proportion of Hispanic students typically tend to be schools with high proportions of poor students. And although this finding suggests a strong association between residential segregation and racial achievement gaps, the key dimension driving this association, Reardon found, is a proportion of students' classmates who are poor. Indeed, a school's poverty rate could be a proxy for general school quality. Schools with high poverty rates tend to have fewer resources overall, and we definitely need more research to help explain the impact of concentrated poverty in urban public schools. There are a number of factors to take into account. First of all, such schools may experience greater difficulty in attracting and retaining competent or skilled teachers. Also, the parents of the students in these schools generally have fewer resources, cultural capital, human capital, that would be beneficial to their children's academic achievement. And this means that schools with a higher percentage of poor students tend to have a higher percentage of low-performing students, which may result in the school offering less advanced curricula. In other words, having low-performing classmates may have an adverse effect on learning by altering instructional and social processes in the classroom. Secondly, as I pointed out previously, a recent study by Robert Sampson and his colleagues shows that residing in a severely disadvantaged neighborhood cumulatively impedes the development of academically relevant verbal ability in children, which affects school performance. Third point, we have to factor in other conditions that are not usually associated with school performance. But research suggests that these factors are important to have in mind, for example, A, the impact of lead contamination on poor children who live in dilapidated buildings on school performance. B, the effect of home evictions on children's school performance that my Harvard colleague Matt Desmond has talked about. And C, the impact of the psychological trauma of witnessing a killing in your neighborhood on school performance. And finally, the direct and indirect effects of peer influence. Peer influence. Indirect and direct effect of peer influence have to be considered. Students from disadvantaged backgrounds are less likely to see a strong association between schooling and post-school employment, and therefore develop different attitudes towards school and schooling. Now, when you consider these combined factors, it is very difficult to deny the proposition that both residential segregation and school segregation contribute to the racial achievement gap. What is not clear is how they are interrelated and their relative importance. And given that most students tend to attend schools that are fairly close to their homes, residential segregation is a key factor shaping school segregation. But we should be careful to distinguish between two types of residential segregation I have talked about: racial segregation and income segregation. And I think it's very important that when we discuss the relationship between residential segregation and school segregation, we are really talking about the type of segregation that is most likely to lead to the highest concentration of poor students of color in neighborhood schools. That is the segregation that combines racial and income separation. This is the kind of segregation that we absolutely have to overcome to reduce the racial disparities in students' exposure to poor classmates, which might be an effective way of improving the equality of students' access to better educational opportunities. And I strongly see the need for greater investment in educational institutions and for programs to provide greater opportunity for occupational mobility so that more youngsters who have been raised in poor families and grown up in poor neighborhoods will improve their chances in life. And this will call for income redistribution through welfare and tax policies, resulting in greater public investment to improve the conditions in poor neighborhoods, as well as the institutions that serve individuals and families in these neighborhoods. But for the foreseeable future, especially given the present political climate, only the most optimistic observer would anticipate that such a program would receive the necessary public and political support. For all of these reasons, the future of poor blacks looks very bleak indeed. And nowhere is this more apparent than when you look at the plight of low-skilled black males. I have to end here, but during the panel discussion, I'll bring out some of these problems that low-skilled black males are experiencing and relate them to the kinds of neighborhoods I've talked about. Thank you.
In 3 ways. You can post your comments on Twitter, email them to Urban Health, or write them on a note card, and there are volunteers with note cards roving the sides of this auditorium. So I think we have the first question coming in. Given the loss of middle-class blacks in the urban inner city and given the important roles of the middle class in providing neighborhood social stability, how might a city rebuild a strong black middle class and create mixed-income neighborhoods? A small question for you, Dr. Wilson.
I haven't done any research on Baltimore, my education about Baltimore depends a lot on watching David Simon's brilliant show, HBO, The Wire. And by the way, Simon's HBO's The Wire is sort of built on research. I called him one day when I was chairing a panel discussion at Harvard on The Wire, which to see if he was willing to, if he had any questions about what we're going to cover during the panel. And I was about to tell him that I watched each episode of The Wire at least 7 times, believe it or not, I have. And I was about to say, Mr. Simon, you know what an honor it is to speak with you. And before I could say anything, he says, Professor Wilson, you know, what an honor it is to speak with you. Do you know your book, When Work Disappears, helped us shape season 2? Man, I was so thrilled. I was walking around campus with a swagger. So there has been out-migration of middle-income families, many working-class families from some of these Baltimore neighborhoods, which helps explain the significant number of abandoned buildings and vacant lots. Now the question is, should we try to encourage middle-class blacks to move back into these neighborhoods? Or should we provide the families who are there the resources to move on to better neighborhoods? So there have been 2 strategies that people have talked about. They've talked about mobility strategies, you know, providing families with vouchers so that they can move from poor neighborhoods to better neighborhoods. And then there are place-based strategies, investing in neighborhoods, so that you can improve the lives of families who live there. Place-based strategies, I think, work well when the neighborhood has not deteriorated to a point where you have a significant number of abandoned buildings, vacant lots, high rates of crime, and so on. Sometimes it's better just to let these neighborhoods go and get people out of there and move them to better neighborhoods. Some neighborhoods you're not going to be able to capture, realistically speaking. But there are a number of poor neighborhoods that are still very viable. And maybe place-based strategies is what we could highlight, including encouraging middle-income families to stay there, or inviting some middle-income families to come back with mixed housing programs. But if you're going to do this, you have to make sure that your mixed housing programs, which would include poor people as well as working-class and middle-class people, do not ultimately lead to the dislocation of poor people because they can no longer afford to live there. That's what happens when neighborhoods sort of undergo gentrification. Rents go up. The cost of housing increases. And in many cases, we see this especially in Washington, D.C., the poor have to leave these neighborhoods because they can no longer afford to live there. So what can we do to allow poor people who live in these neighborhoods that are improving to remain there? Can you hear me? Oh, okay. I thought they said, sorry, you couldn't hear me. Okay. And if you're going to, so I think this is something you have to think about, what can you do? What can the city do? What steps can be taken to allow poor residents to remain in neighborhoods that are undergoing improvement? including neighborhoods that are undergoing gentrification. I think this would be a good topic for some of these panel discussions.
Yeah. We have another question following beautifully onto that. Are there cities that have successfully combated the consequence of increased income segregation and the reduction of opportunities for black youths you so eloquently described?
Not to my knowledge, but there are, here's the thing. I'm often asked, what can cities do to improve the lives of individuals who live in the poorest neighborhoods? Now, ideally, if you're going to address problems like inner city poverty, joblessness, and so on, ideally, the city should be working in concert with the national government. Well, that's not going to happen right now, but at some point, you should be working in concert with the national government to improve these cities. For example, neighborhoods. I pointed out that many of these neighborhoods I described, neighborhoods that feature income segregation coupled with racial segregation, are also characterized by high rates of joblessness. And joblessness triggers other neighborhoods. You give me two neighborhoods with the same poverty rate, and in one neighborhood, most of the significant proportion of the adults are working, and the other neighborhood, they're jobless. I will predict with great accuracy that in the joblessness, there are higher rates of crime, drug addiction, violence, and so on. And I'm especially concerned, one of the things I didn't have a chance to talk about because I went too long in my talk, about the plight of young black males, especially young black males with prison records. What chance, they've been so stigmatized by prison records, what chance do they have of getting a job in the private sector? So this is where the national government comes into play here, and that is creating resources for public sector employment, something that you talked about, Kathy, in your book, $2 a day. Public sector jobs for people who have difficulty finding jobs in the private sector. But there's also something that local communities can do, working with the federal government, and that is developing partnerships between, say, community organizations and the corporations who are housed here in Baltimore. To see, for example, if there could be a creation of summer jobs for teenagers who could get some work experience, apprenticeship jobs, and so on. And then these teenagers would more likely, when they graduate from high school and don't go on to college, it increases their chances of finding a job in the private sector because they've had on-the-job training and people can vouch for them. I don't know, that's a long answer to the question.